All right, so the next one that we're talking about is carbohydrates. And now when it comes to carbohydrates, carbohydrates are literally what our cells love for energy. So when it comes to making sure that our body can tolerate them, when it comes to eating carbs and not having that sluggish food coma feeling, there's a particular way we can go about it to make sure that we optimize our carbohydrate intake. Now, when it comes to carbs, like I said before, act as a precursor to serotonin production. Serotonin being a happy hormone, but serotonin can also be a precursor to melatonin. So it can cause our body, if we're having a nice carby meal at night, to start to feel a little bit tired, food coma, and just want to relax. With our carbohydrates, they're basically our Energizer Bunny nutrient. And carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. So what do carbs actually do in our body? Well, it's pretty cool. They do quite a bit. They feed your mitochondria. So basically, we are a big sack or a big handbag of cells. And in these cells, we've got the cell membrane, and inside the cell membrane, we've got something called your mitochondria. And your mitochondria, see them as Lisa said, the powerhouse of the cell. And this is where what actually feeds healthy mitochondria and helps them to thrive is carbohydrates. What our brain actually uses, we do use fat, and our brain is a lot of fat, it's a lot of water, but our brain primarily uses glycogen, carbohydrates. Our body, whenever we're training above that 60 or 70%, we're using carbohydrates to get there. And our body needs to be able to thrive off carbohydrates, or we can find when we have them, if our mitochondria aren't able to actually receive them, they don't function as well. So carbs, when used appropriately and in a healthy carb-tolerant body, will be feeding your mitochondria. It also supports thyroid function. Again, tying into the fact that when we've got low energy availability, so we're not eating enough food, this can cause an additional layer of stress in our body. Carbohydrates help to regulate that stress by, again, acting as a precursor to serotonin, but also a couple of other good health benefits too. They also support nervous system recovery, fuel, brain, and muscle performance. Again, everything that we do training-wise that's above 60%, we're going to find that we're using carbohydrates. This is why if you have a pre-training carb-dense meal, you will use those carbohydrates, fantastic around training, but you'll also find about 45 or 60 minutes in, if you've been training hard, you've been pushing your blood sugar back down. So what's happening in the body, from a really broken down into like a basic explanation, you eat the carbs, your body and your blood sugar will begin to elevate. You're training, which is a natural way to bring blood sugar down. So you're using carbohydrates, your body is pulling the carbs from your muscles to train hard. You'll get to about 45 or 60 minutes in, and all of a sudden the carbs that were circulating in your blood are now starting to tank, and your body's like, oh, I've got to work harder and empty out my other stores in my liver. That's where, when it comes to having intra-workout carbohydrates, we can also notice a boost in performance, because we're not letting our blood sugar go back down too low, it will still oscillate down, but it will slowly come down. Oscillate is the wrong word, but we'll slowly titrate down. But we want to keep our carbohydrates in while we're training so that our performance and our fuel stays high and we stay focused. When it comes to carb tolerance, this is where how many carbs you can tolerate will determine how useful they currently are for you. It doesn't mean that you have to cut carbohydrates out for life, and it doesn't mean that if you do cut carbs out, you won't notice an improvement. Yeah. So when we cut carbs out, initially what's going to happen, our carbohydrates, glycogen, which is carbohydrates broken down into sugars, is glycogen. Glycogen is then broken down into glucose and glycogen, let's use them a bit interchangeably here, but basically they bind to water in the muscles. So they actually help us to increase our scale weight, but it's actually just our muscles being nice and hydrated. We can often mistake this for fat loss when we first take carbohydrates out, and we find that taking the carbohydrates out, we see a big initial drop off in scale weight, and that's actually just fluid. So stress, when it comes to, again, being chronically underfed, so we're not eating enough calories or just in a chronically stressed state, we're going to find that our ability to tolerate carbs is decreased. And this is because our muscles, and basically imagine your muscles are a nightclub, and you've got the insulin and the carbohydrates, and the insulin's coming around to knock on the door of the nightclub, and the bouncer, which is your insulin receptor, comes up to the door and opens the door. Now, if you are not able to tolerate carbohydrates properly, the insulin is going to be knocking on the door, and the insulin receptor, the bouncer, is going to go, hey, sorry, you can't come in, we're full. And so all of a sudden you've got this extra glucose and insulin circulating in your bloodstream. It has to get out of your bloodstream, so it then shuttles itself towards body fat. This is where, when we're again chronically stressed or cortisol is high, it can make it a little bit more difficult for us to best utilize our carbs. Insulin sensitivity worsens, so we're not getting the bouncer coming up to the door of the nightclub, and carbs can feel like too much. Again, that sluggish feeling. We get the crashes, the fatigue, but we also, because our carbs aren't being directed into our lean tissue, we get that skinny fat look. So the solution isn't fewer carbs, but it's actually fixing the system that it runs with. When it comes to nailing our carbohydrate intake and getting the most out of it, this is where we need to make sure we are eating enough overall. Again, low energy availability means that our body will downregulate all systems that it needs to in order to survive. And if your goal when you're in a fat loss phase is to just survive it, then you will constantly be needing to do fat loss phases as the years go on, because you will never be able to keep that fat off, because you have never given your body a chance to actually learn how to partition the nutrients that it's eating, because you're constantly starving it. And then when you're not starving it, you're constantly overfeeding it. We also need to make sure that we are regulating our stress and we're focusing on rebuilding muscle. So when we're beginning to introduce more carbohydrates into our diet and we're wanting to use them effectively, we want to time them around our best performing times, and that's going to help us absolutely thrive and feel great on them. We also want to make sure that we're sleeping consistently, because we know that even just one night of reduced sleep and then consecutive nights was even worse. But this is from Dr. Rhonda Patrick. This is something where even just one night of reduced sleep reduces someone's ability to regulate insulin and regulate blood sugar by up to about 30%. That is a huge chunk from simply one night of impaired sleep. And this means that what happens is, again, the glucose starts shuttling around our system in our bloodstream. Insulin following along, trying to knock on the doors, trying to open all the doors. And it's like a big knock and run where it knocks, no one's answering because no one's home. Because those insulin receptors are not able to come up to the surface because they're still sleeping because they didn't sleep as well last night, right? As well as that, we want to practice restoring hormonal balance. As a woman, if you are someone who struggles with PMS symptoms, endo, PCOS, something similar like that, it's actually, although it might be common, although you and all of your friends might all share funny naprogesic stories, it's actually not normal. And this is where it's really important, again, that for our body to thrive, we need to put our body in a safe enough state. And our monthly report card of how great you've made your body feel comes at the end of every cycle in that luteal phase. So if you're struggling to tolerate your carbs and feeling heavy or sluggish, I want to give you 3 hacks to try this week. And that is consuming a small portion of bitter greens or vinegar at the start of a meal. This is really cool because bitter greens help to assimilate and release a few more digestive enzymes and help to produce a little bit of bile production as well, which helps us to then break down the carbohydrates a little bit better, produce a little bit more insulin, and regulate everything as it starts to move through our stomach to our small intestine, and as it starts to go around to different doors of the body. We can break that down quicker break it down, better, because we're slowing down the glucose spike. So because we're not having that rush up, we're not having that rush up of insulin either, but we're also slowing down that increase. So instead of it being a knock where it's like, let me in, I've got this line backed up of all this glucose. Instead, it's like, hey, I got 1 or 2 guys, can we come in? And then the bouncer is like, okay, come in. That's what happens when we have some bitter greens and vinegar before our meal. We then want to prioritize for now swapping to higher fiber carbs. When it comes to breaking down carbohydrates, if we're having quick to digest carbs, think your rice, your honey, your rice cakes, lollies. This is where pasta, bread, we're typically going to find that we feel a little bit more sluggish eating these things. So instead, if we can prioritize having something like white potato, for a good example, white potato or a different type of potato, or more fibrous veg like our pumpkin, our carrot, beetroot, all these little things with a little bit more fiber in them will again slow down how quickly the food moves from the stomach to the small intestine. And then as it's passing through and your body's receiving that message that, hey, I've just had some glucose come in, so I've got to start producing some insulin, this is where it slows down that production. So because we're not having to move as fast, communication gets to be so much clearer. That's not just in your gut, that's for life, okay? Then, last but not least, we also have consuming 500 to 700 mils of your juice of choice in your pre/intra-workout hydration. So we know that when we're training, we're going to be using 60 to 70% of, if we're training above 60 to 70%, we're going to be using carbohydrates. we need to remember that once we hit about 45 minutes into the session, we're probably going to have a dip. And the more that we restrict our carbohydrates when we're training, because when we're training, we're elevating everything. We're in a high cortisol state, a high impact state, because things are happening, things are going on. When this is happening, it's really important to note that if we are not giving our body carbs in this time, so we are staying more stressed, not just in the session, but also after the session, we're delaying our recovery. And our carbohydrates help us to get that recovery process started, even when we're boosting our performance at the same time. And that's by making sure that, again, we have our carbohydrates either before and during, or even just during. I will bring this juice, and my clients will also do the same sort of a thing with juice.